The time between applying to medical school and hearing back about interviews can be incredibly stressful. You've just put all kinds of time and care and work into getting your applications just right, getting them submitted on time, and then it feels like everything just comes to a halt. As there isn't a universally accepted timeline for getting back to students about interviews, the wait in and of itself can be really trying and really difficult to deal with. So today I want to give you at least a rough timeline of when you can expect to hear back, and also give you some ideas of what you can do with all that waiting time. First, hi, my name is Dr. Sarah Klebe, and I'm an admissions expert at BeMo. So today I'll talk about when you can hear back from med schools for interviews in the US, Canada, and the UK. And I'll start with the US because in the US, if you're applying there with the large number of medical schools and similarly huge number of med school applicants, you're going to be in for a wait. There's just no easy way to say it. Some people may get interview invitations earlier in the cycle. I'll talk about when that happens in just a minute. But you should go ahead and expect a long wait ahead of you, regardless of whether you've applied through AMCAS, TMDSAS, or ACOMAS. There is no standardized timeline, and a concrete answer to the question, when do you hear back from medical schools for interviews, may be rather elusive. There are some general parameters, though. If you apply through AMCAS, AMCAS generally starts transmitting applicant information to schools starting on July 1st at the very earliest. At that point, secondary applications are sent out to those who have completed a primary application at that time. Schools using AMCAS then start interviewing often around September, but that's the very earliest. Those interviews, or that interview season, carries through all the way to early December with a little break over the winter break, and then interviews resume again through January and February, some interviews even happening as late as early March. So if you're applying through AMCAS, you could be in for almost a full year wait if you submit your application at the earliest possible date. So settle in, grab a cup of hot chocolate and a warm blanket, and take good care of yourself. I'll talk more about that at the end of the video, but you're going to be in for a wait. TMDSAS, so schools in Texas, do tend to start interviewing a little bit earlier, often starting around July. But again, those interviews run through the late summer, through the fall, pause over winter break, and then a few interviews resume around early to mid-January. And finally, in the U.S., if you're applying through ACOMAS, so to a DO program, osteopathic programs report the earliest interviews generally taking place around late August, again, running through the fall, pausing in mid to late December, and then often resuming from January to early March. So U.S. students, it's going to be a long night, as it were. You're going to be in for a wait, so be prepared for it. Again, you may hear back earlier. Remember, the U.S. has rolling admissions, so those who apply earliest get the first consideration and will usually get the first set of interview invitations. But if you go ahead and tell yourself, hey, it could be a long wait, we could be here a long time, that's going to cut down your stress and anxiety. And that's really important, especially at this stage in your education. Again, I'll come back to that in just a few moments. One thing that I wanted to just help U.S. students bear in mind is the fact that there are almost 200 medical schools in the U.S., to which upwards of 50,000 aspiring med students apply every year, and evaluating that sheer number of applications just takes time, right? Think about all the materials you had to put together for your application, your CV, transcripts, test scores, application essays, letters of recommendation, secondary essays, and so on. Now multiply that by 50,000 to get a grasp of the scope of the task that application reviewers face. That is massive. That is a ton of information to review. And it's in your best interest to have all of your information reviewed carefully and thoroughly. So again, I know the wait is a painful one, but trust that they're getting through all those applications as quickly as they can while still giving everyone the evaluation they deserve. You don't want them just scanning their eyes over your application and tossing it into one pile or another. You want them to really, mull over that amount of information that you've given them about yourself. So even though the wait itself can be painful and tedious, there's a good reason for it. So, trust the process a little bit and understand that it just takes time to get through that many applications. Now, for Canadian students, in terms of when you hear back from medical schools for interviews, Canada doesn't have rolling applications like the US, so most med school interview invites come out around the same time, and interviews happen over a much shorter span of time as well. So that does mean a little bit more certainty in terms of the process, which could result in a little bit less stress, a little bit less turmoil, but there is still going to be a somewhat considerable wait in between application and interview invitation. Many Canadian medical schools have an early October deadline for application submission, and most of the interview invitations in Canada come out in January and February, with interviews taking place between February and April. The exact dates obviously are going to vary from school to school. Some have interviews spread out over several weeks or months. Others have a few big interview weekends where they complete all interviews over a rather short span of time. Also note that while most Canadian medical schools follow that general timeline, you have to verify the dates with the individual schools because there is some variation, in particular Quebec schools and those in the Maritimes. So for example, Dalhousie generally has a late July deadline for their primary applications, with interview invites often coming out as early as October. And Quebec schools vary widely in terms of their application due dates, and that can make a difference to their interview invitation timeline as well. If you're a Canadian med student or aspiring Canadian med student and mid-February rolls around and you haven't received a med school interview invitation, then look into some of the suggestions I'm going to give you a little bit later to think about how best to move forward. And then if you're in the UK, the majority of students apply to university through the UCAS application, which has a single standardized due date for med school applications, usually in mid-October. In general, not exclusively, but in general, UK also doesn't use rolling admissions like the United States or rolling application process. So the wait, again, isn't quite as arduous as it is for aspiring med students in the US. And there is a more straightforward timeline for interview invites and interviews, but there is variation. For the most part, UK students can expect to hear back about medical school interviews between November and March. So again, still a pretty wide span of time. Most schools do seem to try to get their invitations out just before or just after Christmas, though there are some exceptions. So the best thing that you can do is check with individual schools to see what their timeline for medical school interview invitations is, because they do vary from institution to institution. But the majority of students should know prior to the beginning of the new calendar year whether or not they have an interview. And the schools do tend to try to give at least 2 weeks notice before the interview. So send the invitation at least 2 weeks before the interview is going to take place. If you're in the UK and January 1st rolls around and you haven't received an invitation yet, again, refer to what I'm about to say in just a minute to think through how you can plan to move forward. That doesn't necessarily mean you won't get an invite, but that's getting pretty close to the cutoff date for when invitations tend to come out. So, regardless of where you're applying, you're going to be in for a wait. There's just no getting around that. So you want to plan ahead and you want to use that time wisely. Again, the first and probably best piece of advice I can give you is expect the wait. If you happen to be one of the lucky few who gets an invitation at the very earliest stages of the process, awesome. Good for you. That's great. But go ahead and prepare to settle in and wait it out. If you tell yourself that it's unlikely that you'll hear anything prior to, say, January 1st in the US, prior to January 1st in the UK, and prior to, say, mid-February in Canada, then you're going to hopefully save yourself some sleepless nights in the interim. And again, if you happen to hear back before then it's just a happy surprise. So I think that's the best mindset to go into this with. Remember, if you're a traditional student, then during this time, you're still going to be completing part of your education, and you need to focus your efforts there and not be distracted by this stress if at all possible. And even if you're on a gap year or if you're applying after having graduated, then you've likely got other commitments like work that require your attention. If you're constantly distracted by the stress of waiting to hear back from medical schools for your interview, that's going to impact your productivity, it's going to impact your performance, and it's going to impact your engagements with others in your volunteering, clinical work, and other roles where you should be gaining experience and going through that process of professionalization. So again, going in with that mindset of expecting the wait is going to help keep you from being distracted by the stress of that waiting. So what should you do instead of worrying? Well, first off, keep in mind there isn't really much that you can do at this stage to alter that timeline or speed it up. Worrying in this case isn't going to help you. Worrying isn't going to make anything happen more quickly. If anything, it's going to negatively impact you. So instead of worrying, here are some things you can do. If it's at the sort of early stages of that medical school interview invitation timeline, make a mental note that this is going to be a stressful time. So use this as an opportunity to really refine your stress management strategies. If you're hoping to become a medical professional, you're getting ready to enter a line of work that is inherently stressful. So learning to compartmentalize that stress and dedicate your efforts where you can actually make a difference is absolutely critical. So one thing you can do is focus on your own health and self-care. If you're prioritizing your physical and mental well-being, that's something that is going to help you throughout your entire professional life. It helps you with your overall performance, and it helps manage and mitigate stress. Equally important, if you're focusing on your own wellness during this time, then when the interview invitation does come along, you're going to be in your best shape possible, right? You're going to feel physically and mentally well if you're physically and mentally caring for yourself during that time, right? So you want to be at your best. So focus on exercise, nutrition, healthy habits, whatever you can do within your own scope and your own limitations to help you feel like you're at your best is going to benefit you when you do go in to interview. Similarly, taking time to prioritize your mental well-being, taking time for self-enrichment, taking time to spend with your friends and family is a great thing to do during this waiting period. If you want to travel and are able to travel and do some, just seeing the world and things like that, take this time to do that if it's something that you're able to do. Take time for leisure activities, enrich yourself by reading or taking on creative projects, learning new hobbies and things like that. Have weekly meals with your loved ones, anything else that helps to strengthen your interpersonal relationships and enhance your own mental well-being. Once you get into medical school and then continue on into residency in your own practice, time will be your most precious commodity, and there will never be enough time for all the things that you want to do. So while you have some time, while you're waiting and finishing up the work that you're currently doing, prioritize those relationships and your own personal development while you're able to. It's a great way to make good use of that time, and all of these things help relieve stress. Finally, during this time, again at the beginning of the interview invitation timeline, keep up your volunteering, your clinical work, your shadowing, and other related activities, making sure that you stay connected to the medical community. This is a great time to continue your own professional development, refine your knowledge, and all of that. But also, if it turns out that you aren't accepted during this cycle, these experiences will help you when you reapply next cycle. So you want to maintain those activities to demonstrate your continued dedication, to keep gaining more experience, and to ultimately make you an even more competitive applicant. So next, if you get around to the sort of midpoint of that medical school invitation timeline, medical school interview invitation timeline, and you haven't heard back yet, there are a few things you can do. So first, you can consider sending a medical school letter of intent or an update letter to the school, especially if you have a specific connection with the school or program or feel you're a particularly good fit. A letter of this kind allows you to update the admissions committee of any new developments in your own personal or academic life. So you can send recent copies of your transcripts with new grades on them, include any new information about your work and activities since you submitted your application. So any new volunteer work you're doing, any leadership opportunities, honors, accomplishments, awards, jobs, research projects, anything else that hasn't yet been conveyed in your primary or secondary applications can be included in a letter like this. So you can articulate your specific reasons for wanting to attend that particular program, why you feel like you're a good fit with their mission, vision, and values. And you can just overall help them just add a little bit more weight to your application if you think that's necessary at this stage. So if you're in the US, the time to do this would be around December. In Canada, mid-February would be an appropriate time, and in the UK, early January would be the time to consider a move like this. Now, do note, if you've ever received anything from the school stating that they don't want update letters or letters of intent, then obviously you shouldn't send one. You should, only do this if they haven't said they don't want it. Now, that's rare. Most schools are happy to receive update letters and things like that, but just go back through your emails and your communication with them first to confirm that they're open to receiving these kinds of letters. Another option at this stage is to ask an advocate, usually one of your letter writers, to call the admissions dean on your behalf. If you feel that you're a particularly good fit for a specific program, having someone of stature within the academic community, so likely a professor or someone like that, reach out to emphasize that good fit can impact the overall evaluation of your application. So if you have other things that you can add to your application that have happened since you submitted your primary and secondaries, you can write a letter, and again, having someone call on your behalf is always a good move. Now, finally, if it's late into the interview invitation timeline, weeks and months have dragged on, you've received no invites, and you're in the final weeks of the timeline, there's only one thing really left that you can do, and that is start doing some damage control and start planning for the next application cycle. Again, as I noted earlier, during this entire time, you should be maintaining volunteer activities, clinical experiences, research, and all of that as just part of your overall professionalization, but also to add to your application if it's not successful this time. So you're continuing to build your CV in the event that you're not accepted. Along with that, it's time to sort of sit down and do an honest and thorough evaluation of your application materials and your education work and activities up to this point. If you didn't get a medical school interview invitation this time, that simply means your application wasn't as competitive as it needs to be yet. That doesn't mean that this is the end of your journey. That doesn't mean that your dream of med school has to die. Quite the opposite. Resilience and self-correction are key qualities that they seek in future medical professionals. So this shouldn't be the end of your journey. This is the time for you to demonstrate your resilience and your ability to self-correct. So this should act as a prompt for you to examine what went wrong this time and what you can do to put together a stronger application next time. So reflect on your MCAT score, especially how it compares to the matriculants last year at your schools of choice. You can look this up on the AAMC's Med School Admissions and Requirements website, the MSAR website. Look and see if your score is truly competitive. If not, consider taking it again. In terms of your GPA, same thing. Compare to last year's matriculants. Might it be in your best interest to take some additional courses to help bump your GPA up a little bit? Are there modifications that you could make to your current course load if you're still in school that could help improve your GPA? Would it be a good idea to try a post-bac program before applying to med school again? It can be really hard to make these really substantial increases to your GPA, but sometimes some additional courses, a post-bac, or even some graduate study can help offset less than ideal grades. In terms of your actual application, think about the date at which you applied, especially again if you're in the US and they have that rolling admissions process, as well as whether or not you've applied strategically. So first, if you're in the US, did you apply early? Those who apply earliest get earliest consideration in the rolling admissions process. So applying at the very beginning is really important. Regardless of whether you're in the US, Canada, or UK, you can also ask whether you've applied strategically or whether you applied only to your dream schools. So by applying strategically, what I mean is, did you only apply to those schools where you have the strongest chance of getting in? Again, you can go to the AAMC MSAR website and look up the admission statistics of pretty much every medical school in the United States, at least, to see what it is to be competitive at those schools, what you need to have at those schools to be a competitive candidate. So look at those admission statistics and apply only to those schools where you can realistically get in. A lot of students ask, how many medical schools should I apply to? And the answer to that is really just another question. And that question is, how many schools could you realistically gain admission to? Right? So figure out where your scores are going to be the most competitive and focus your efforts there the next time you apply. Think about your letters of recommendation and your verifiers, if that's relevant. Usually that's just for certain applications. And you're not going to have access to the content of your letters of recommendation generally. So think about who wrote those letters for you and whether they were the best letter writers for your application. Again, did you consider your possible letter writers strategically, or did you just reach out to your favorite professors or whoever said yes the fastest? Similarly, if you had an application that required verifiers, did you choose the best verifiers for your work and activities? Choosing the best references actually takes a lot of planning and relationship building, and it shouldn't be rushed. You need to consider the potential strength both of each individual letter writer and how those letters work together, how those references work together as a group. Each individual should be able to speak to much more than just your academic performance. They need to be someone with whom you've interacted, who can speak to your strengths and your qualities, not just the mark that you got in their course. So again, as a group, all of your letters should complement each other, demonstrating different aspects of your personality, your dedication, and your suitability for the profession. You can look at your work and activities. Have you demonstrated clear and consistent dedication to the field of medicine and to your own professional development? Or have you done the basic minimum in terms of work, volunteering, shadowing, clinical experiences, research, and all that? Because, quite frankly, with 50,000 applicants in the US alone, the bare minimum just isn't enough. You're not going to get in with the bare minimum. Schools want students that have demonstrated the capacity to go above and beyond, because that's what's needed to be an effective physician. So do an honest accounting for your time leading up to application, and take on some additional opportunities if you need to round out your application. And again, this will benefit you even more by giving you more opportunities to refine your skills, your professionalization, to serve others, which is going to make you a more competitive applicant next time. And then finally, consider your application itself. particularly your personal statement, secondaries, or any other essays that you had to write. Again, you need to be sort of brutally honest with yourself. This is not the time for excuses. It's the time for stark reality. Did you devote the time and effort needed to compose something truly great and reflective of your skills and dedication? Or did you crank out a draft overnight and send it in? Did you go through the process of brainstorming, outlining, composing multiple drafts and rewrites, getting expert feedback, reviewing for impeccable grammar and flow, crafting a shining gem of a document over days, if not weeks, of composition, review, and revision for each and every essay you wrote? It's not possible to understate how important these documents are. And if you didn't take those steps, then this is most likely the reason that your application isn't as competitive as it needs to be. Again, the bare minimum isn't enough. So if your essays weren't truly exceptional, then they likely didn't grab the attention of the admissions committee. And if that doesn't happen, then the chances of being invited to interview are pretty much zero. So the period of waiting to hear back about interviews can be excruciating. It can be very difficult, very stressful. But hopefully now you have a better understanding of when to start, when to become concerned, and what to do with all that time in the meantime, where you simply step back, let the process play out, and focus on yourself, your own well-being, and your ongoing professionalization. It's impossible to get rid of all of the stress that comes from that waiting, but there are ways to use that nervous energy productively, ensuring that you're at your very best if an interview invitation does come in, while also maintaining or increasing your competitiveness if you do have to reapply. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful. If so, please do go ahead, like it, share it with a friend who might benefit from it, and be sure to follow us on whichever social media platform you're on right now. If you'd like us to help you, click the link that should appear either above or below this video to see our programs and schedule a free initial consultation. We'll set you up with one of our admissions experts to answer any questions you might have and get you started on your preparations. We have programs to suit any of your needs, and we're always happy to work with you to determine which plan will support you and your goals most effectively. As ever, thank you so very much for your time. Take good care, and I'll see you next time.